This lecture is going to deal with a variety of movements that all fall under the idea of fractured forms, as I put it. And these are the movements that are the dawn of the 20th century. So, our movement towards modernity and modernism that we talked about in the realism lecture is becoming fully realized at this time as you move towards 20th century art. And again, the things that seem to drive this art is an idea of the fracture or the break. Now, I'm going to show you a lot of different movements in this lecture, but they all fall under the umbrella term of Expressionism. Expressionism, in a sense, isn't a movement, it's an idea. It's this sense of art making that's about thought, not what it is. So I gave you the Picasso quote because I think it's helpful. Picasso said, "I paint objects as I think them, not as I see them." So he was using something internal to himself. He was using a sort of an internal dialogue to drive his art making. He wasn't looking at the world and trying to replicate it. So if you go back and you look at realism, romanticism, right, Baroque art, Renaissance art, they may have had different values, but there's really no sense of trying to reinterpret the world as it stands, let's say. These artists are going to reinterpret the way you look at the world entirely. They're going to paint things as they think them. So, Expressionism is an umbrella term for the various movements that you see in the early 20th century, like Cubism, like Futurism. So, again, you can talk about Expressionism, but you're not really talking about a movement. You're talking about the idea that guides these particular movements. So that can be a little complicated. Make sure you spend some time considering the idea of Expressionism as an umbrella term, not a movement in and of itself. And what guides Expressionist movements? This is the early 20th century, and you have the event of World War I and what comes after it. So dealing with World War I, you're looking 1914 to 1919, and basically this war in Europe, right, fractures everything that had been held together before this time. Political alliances, right, governmental, standings, right, everything is thrown to the wind, right, with World War I. Well, I think about the idea of a fractured world because before this, there was some cohesion about how governments were operating. You understood what it was to be French. You understood what it was to be British. There was some guidance there, but I say World War I kind of throws everybody off their axis, throws them into this sort of new world order that is very much about fracturing things apart. And I think that World War I, it creates a new atmosphere for art to be made in. The rules of modernism had been laid down and were very important, but I think this sort of just shoves it, further on down the road, this idea of fracturing and fragmentation and not being able to know who you trust or you don't trust, not understanding the world around you and how it appears and what it looks like. I think it really challenges what is representation anyway? What is it to represent something? What is it to be truthful? And does it matter? So I think these modern artists are now like, no, it doesn't matter. I can see the world as I define it. I don't have to care about, reality. What is reality anyway? So yeah, it's a very different attitude, right, that these artists are going to be carrying along with them. And another thing I wanted to mention is this is one of the first times we really see artists defining themselves. We had seen it a little bit with the realists and the impressionists because they were starting their own salons. So think of the Salon des Refusés, the Salon des Indépendants. Those salons are about trying to define their own movements. But this is when we see it fully realized. And what these artists do now is they coalesce into movements and they write their own manifesto. They write down what are the principles that guide their movement. This is because they felt they didn't want critics defining them. So even if you look at the Impressionists, their name comes from a critic, kind of saying, this is what you are. So I think artists were trying to take their own agency upon them. They were trying to say, okay, we want to define who we are before the critics even get around to it. So we'll write up a manifesto that will explain what our values are to everyone else around them. For instance, in this lecture, you'll look at the Futurists, and they're very famous for their manifesto. So it was a way of trying to define themselves artistically, philosophically, before someone else could do it for them. So these are some things to think about as we look at these particular movements. Now, as I mentioned, Expressionism is really an umbrella term, and there's many movements that sort of fall under that umbrella. One of them is Fauvism. Fauvism comes about in France, and the term literally refers to the idea of wild beasts. Now, a critic actually did say this, so, they weren't completely self-defined. So critics said it looked like a bunch of fauves or a bunch of wild beasts painted these paintings. And what he really was referring to is the arbitrary use of color. So here you see probably the most famous Fauvist, who was Henri Matisse. And Matisse was known for taking that post-impressionist concern with color, so the things that like Gauguin was kind of playing with, and again, just pushing it a little bit further on, making it a little bit more over the top. This is a portrait of his wife, Madame Matisse. It's called Woman in a Hat, with a hat. And notice as we look at this woman, we're really looking at arbitrary use of color. Now, what does arbitrary mean? Arbitrary means that it is not aligned with nature. It is used against nature. So look at her face, for instance. That's not a realistic use of color on a face, let's say. That's the best way I can define it in this piece. Even in the background, it's these splotches and splooshes of color. And probably not what you would see in the background of someone's home or, a cafe or something like that. It's all about the arbitrariness of how the color is being used. It's being used against nature. So these artists were looked at as being expressionistic because, again, they were painting something as they thought it, not as it really looks. And so Matisse really makes his career, again, kind of taking that emotional impulse of color that the post-impressionists had and, again, just capitalizing on it, right? Figuring out something even more dramatic and outrageous to do with it. And he crafts these pieces that are very much about how color normally does not operate in our world. It's very arbitrary in its nature. I love the red room because red is a very powerful color. It's symbolically powerful, but it also is powerful in how it works on your emotions. I've mentioned this before. It's an agitating color. It's a color that infuses energy. It's very agitating in how it can be used. So it's probably not a color you would pick for an interior like this dining room that we're seeing here. And then he kind of plays around with, the drama of the color, yes, but he plays around with the drama of like the vine-like patterns that are sort of almost growing up and around. And are they on the tablecloth? Are they on the wallpaper? Are they organic? Are they real? Or are they not? You're left kind of with these questions in your mind. And then I love on the wall, you have either what could be viewed as a painting or perhaps it's a window. So there's all these questions kind of left up in the air, and a good expressionist would say, I don't really need to answer them. It's not important. It's not important what reality is. It's important what I want to show you, right? What I want to demonstrate to you. Another movement that sort of fell under the expressionist umbrella is the movement of non-representation, what we call non-representational art. People like Piet Mondrian fall into this camp. You see a quote from him here. And of course, Vasily Kandinsky, whose artwork you see here. And Mondrian says, line and color are the essence of painting. Hence, they must be freed from their bondage to the imitation of nature and allowed to exist for themselves. God, I love this quote because it tells you everything you need to know about non-representational art. Non-representational art is not about representing something. It's about taking the elements of art. Here, it's painting. So line, color, these are things I teach people in art appreciation. It's the basics. I'm like, here's what color does. Here's what line does, right? Line defines forms. Color creates, mood and texture and, scene and setting. You have to use these elements wisely, right, to create a representational scene. But what if the elements were left free to do whatever they wanted to do? Right? What if they had no bondage to the imitation of nature, in a sense? And that's what these artists really want to explore. So Mondrian, Kandinsky, he's the one you're seeing here, and in the last painting, they're really looking at what is it to not represent. And this is groundbreaking stuff. No one had ever seen anything like this before, This is the point in the class where usually people might start arguing with me, like that my kid could do that. And I'm like, that's not the point because your kid wouldn't think this way. So this is when I tell my students, you have to think about the theory behind the paintings. why are they doing them? Not be like condescending, like my kid could make that. Or, that's so simple. But that's not what it's about. It's about what is the theory that Kandinsky had. And Kandinsky's theory was he wanted line and color to have their own reasons for existing. He wanted them to not be about defining forms or coloring forms. He wanted them to exist for their own reasons. So in a painting like this, and in the previous painting, the lines and the colors are free. If you're looking at the painting and you're interpreting things in the painting, he would say, that's just you being a human, because our base instinct is to want to interpret. So if you see a fried egg or a pair of eyelashes or a little castle on a hill, he would say, yeah, that's just you. That's you trying to interpret what's not there. I didn't put that there. I put shapes and colors and lines, and they were all free to do their own thing. It's not a landscape. It's an improvisation. It's in the title. It's not about representing the real world to you. It's about letting the elements come out to play, as I put it. And think about the idea of improvisation as a title. Right away, first off, he's not giving you a descriptive title because there is nothing to describe. And he's talking about his practice, that these kind of works are improvisations, right? They are about letting things come naturally, letting things come out of the ether. When we start talking about surrealism, we're going to get further into this rabbit hole, right? But letting things naturally occur that might be there in your brain, letting them come out, and just letting the process guide you. So he's not naming it anything because there's nothing to name it. So improvisation number 28. It was the 28th time he did this. That's really the only meaning there is to it. And again, I always see this lecture as the one on realism, and then this lecture as the schism, as I put it. It's sometimes where I lose people in the class because they're like, what is this? I can't define it. I can't, it doesn't look appropriate. It's not about talent or skill in the way that I understand. It's not about, objects as I understand them. And I say you have to get real comfortable with art theory, and you have to get really comfortable with the idea of idea versus object. And you have to let that drive you forward, because if you don't, you're really going to not have too much fun moving on. Because these artworks you're going to see moving into the 20th century are all about theory. They're all about experimentation. They're all about breaking new ground. They're very avant-garde. And they're very art for art's sake. And Kandinsky felt very strongly that, again, he was exploring new territory. He was going somewhere different, and he wanted to see where that journey would take him. People like Kandinsky, I always say, they weren't interested in the status quo in art. And they wanted to do something wholly unseen. And you'll keep seeing that again and again and again as we keep going on into the 20th century.